Theology and Ethics today. My name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola. And it's my pleasure and privilege to do so. So on behalf of Dr. Bob DeVito and our colleagues in the Department of Theology who are co-sponsoring this symposium, I extend a warm greeting to all on this Zoomcast. A kind welcome also from our dedicated center staff, our center manager, Megan Toomey, our graduate assistant, Kathleen McNutt. Megan and Kathleen are the main architects of today's symposium and have put lots of creativity and passion and organizational savvy into this. They've envisioned and prepared this superb program, and they've also assembled this compelling array of speakers and these topics that we kind of all imagined together, or they have, I should say, these great students, Kathleen and Megan being students themselves. So I'm really grateful for their work, and I'm really, really excited about today's presentations and, of course, the discussions that will follow. I really also like, what a word, in the academic way we like things, the title of today's symposium, Science of the Times, Context, Contingency, Crisis. I was thinking about crisis specifically, and it occurred to me last night that in our lives together, this word keeps coming up. This is the gift that keeps on giving. So I kind of bookend experience to share with you kind of briefly as we begin. My first class as a doctoral student in Berkeley in the late 1990s was a poetry seminar with the subtitle, Crisis in Poetry. The focus was 19th century French poets mainly, Mallarmé, Baudelaire, Rimbaud. But then by the end of that course, we transgressed those epochal boundaries and found crisis to be an enduring condition in poetry, and therefore a humanity. Bartleby, humanity, right? The second bookend I want to share is the last Zoom event that I attended personally. It was this week, Tuesday evening, a Penn Faulkner event sponsored by Penn Faulkner with a conversation with T.C. Boyle, Jenny Offal, and Nnedi Okorafor, great authors, all three. The title of the event, A Literary Conversation, Crisis. So there's even a third bookend I can offer from just this morning. If you consider this Dorothy Parker-ish thing that I woke up to, my friend Rocio posted on Facebook, and the little meme went like this. Remember, the sun will come out tomorrow and shine on a whole new batch of fresh, unbelievable horrors. You'll laugh while you're gritting your teeth. And I say, all is not lost, right? And I know our speakers today are really well on to these topics. They'll offer not only words of challenge, indictment, excoriation, but they'll also offer counsels of mercy, compassion, and community. They will offer, in short, resources in theology, a most integrated toolbox, exemplary in its interdisciplinarity, primeval in that way even. The Hank Center is happy to host this series of conversations today and happy to support students and provide venues for presentation and dialogue. It's always been a value of ours, a value of the center's from its earliest days. We're now into 15 years. Many of our speakers featured here today, I was noticing, it's not their first time working with the center. I'm happy to report. Whether on important projects on Catholic thought and democracy, receiving the groundbreaking encyclical such as Laudato Si, exploring the mysteries of the Catholic imagination. As always, we are ever edified, educated, and sustained by student voices. And so I wish our speakers well, and I commend them on their preparation and their dedication, especially in these very difficult times, this very difficult year, this time of crisis again. So good luck with your papers, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And it's now my pleasure to hand it over to Kathleen McNutt, who will provide a further welcome and then convene our first session. Good luck, and thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. My name is Kathleen McNutt, and I'm a PhD candidate in the theology department, and I'm the current graduate assistant at the Hank Center. So on behalf of the Center Manager, Megan Toomey, and myself, I'd like to welcome you all once again to our symposium today. When Dr. Murphy invited us to put a program together, we thought about taking the opportunity to highlight some of the amazing and relevant work our colleagues in ethics and theology are doing. Our broad theme is context, contingency, crisis. Our colleagues do theology and ethics from many contexts and locations, building from our experiences and concerns and reading the signs of the times. The last few years especially have been a time of contingency and crisis for many, leading many of us to reflect theologically on COVID, racism, climate change, abuse of power, gender and sexuality, and more. We look forward to these conversations with all of you. While we certainly hope you will be able to stay for the whole program, we understand that everyone has commitments and busy lives. You can use the same Zoom link to come back at any point today. Just a logistical note, if you have a question for any of the panelists, we ask that you put it in the chat box and using the drop-down menu, direct it to the moderator of the session, who will introduce themselves at the beginning of each session. Again, thank you for being here, and I'm going to hand it over to Marty, who is moderating our first panel today.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to have you. I'd like to extend our thanks to the Hank Center and Dr. Murphy on behalf of the panel, as well as all of the hard work that Kathleen and Megan put into this day today. And with that being said, we're going to start our first panel today, which is entitled Meeting the Moment, Challenges and Models for Hope in the U.S. Church. And I'm super excited to be moderating this. I think it's an important note to start off with this idea of hope among theologies of context here. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker for today, Dan Cosacchi. And as Dr. Murphy noted, a lot of our friends speaking today are going to be people that have come through the program itself. All right, and this is the first example of that. Dan earned his doctorate in Christian ethics here at Loyola with a dissertation entitled Earthly Destruction, Catholic Social Teaching, War and the Environment. Dan is currently Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Justice and Peace Studies Program at Marywood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He is also co-editor of the Berrigan Letters, personal correspondences between Daniel and Philip Berrigan. And he is in progress on publishing another book with Paulus Press entitled Pope Francis's Great Americans, which is going to be the basis for his talk today. And that wonderful speech that the Pope gave on his visit here. So his talk today, again, is entitled Pope Francis's Great American Bash, Lincoln, King, Day, Merton, and Us. So go ahead, Dan.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Marty. To begin, everybody, just allow me a quick word of thanks to Dr. Mike Murphy and especially to the organizers of this conference, Megan Toomey and Kathleen McNutt in particular. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you. I am especially grateful to be sharing this panel discussion with two of my closest friends and colleagues, Karen and Brent. I just have to say, I just really wish we were all in Chicago right now. That would make this even better. But this will have to do. This is great. This is great. There's a temptation at a conference like this to dwell on the title of the event, Signs of the Times, and then to spend most of my time speaking about the Second Vatican Council. I won't do that. But I do think a word on this overarching theme is worthwhile, since it is what ties together everything that we will hear today. Every theologian who will speak at this conference today is doing her or his work in the shadow of the council. Whether post-conciliar or post-conciliar is the right term, I am not sure. What I am sure of, however, is that the title of this conference gives direction to much of our work, the signs of the times. As you know, that phrase comes from paragraph 4 of the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes. The Church has always had the duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times and of interpreting them in the light of the gospel. Thus, in language intelligible to each generation, she can respond to the perennial questions which people ask about this present life and the life to come, and about the relationship of the one to the other. Now, very few figures have demonstrated the ability to interpret the signs of the times in the light of the gospel as much as Pope Francis has. In this country, perhaps his most memorable moment came while delivering an address to a joint session of Congress on September 24th, 2015. During that historic address, Francis highlighted 4 great Americans as inspirations for how we could move forward as a people through crises, tensions, and conflicts. The 4 figures, as you may recall, are Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. In the remainder of my time, I will provide some examples of the writings and lives of these figures that will illustrate why Francis characterizes them as great Americans. Then I will examine a few things that we can learn from each of them. Finally, in a concluding section, I will turn to us. How can we set ourselves apart as great Americans today? One simple caveat. Clearly, my points in this paper are only a brief entree into the thought of each of these figures, and so time prevents me from getting into more detail in the case of any of them. So you'll just have to buy the book when it comes out, right? Okay, first, Abraham Lincoln. It is a matter of some debate as to which of Lincoln's writings or addresses is his most famous. Among the main contenders, certainly, would be the Emancipation Proclamation, issued in its final form on January 1st, 1863. When Pope Francis refers to Lincoln as the guardian of liberty, the Emancipation Proclamation was perhaps the text that first came to the minds of the congressional audience, as well as the millions watching around the world. But Lincoln's role as emancipator goes beyond the few paragraphs dedicated to him in Francis's address. Moreover, Lincoln is much more complicated and nuanced than the popular imagery we get of him in our school lectures or in national hagiographies. While Lincoln may rightly be considered a guardian of liberty in his historical moment, he also would definitely fall short of what Ibram X. Kendi would call an anti-racist, or one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. While the Emancipation Proclamation ushered into American life one of the most anti-racist policies ever enacted, the question remains as to Lincoln's own personal philosophy. After all, he wrote the following words to Horace Greeley on August 20th, 1862, quote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it," end quote. So how did Lincoln get from such a position that today any fair-minded person would consider morally repugnant to the status of cherished hero of the Civil War? Indeed, the most influential Black American of the 19th century, Frederick Douglass, recalled Lincoln as the, quote, "first great man that I talked with in the United States freely, who in no single instance reminded me of the difference between himself and myself, of the difference of color," end quote. As Doris Kearns Goodwin astutely notes, this was no trivial statement, because Douglass had occasion to converse with dozens of celebrated abolitionists, including Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, and Salmon Chase. By naming Lincoln in his address to Congress then, Francis made an important choice. Lincoln is an American that everyone listening to the address would know by name and by reputation. But what is the theological significance of his guardianship of liberty? Lincoln would not have been familiar with the term liberation theology, and it would be anachronistic to apply such a term to Lincoln's own time. However, some of the key elements of 20th century Latin American liberation theology would also apply to the Emancipation Proclamation, and indeed Lincoln's tenure as president. As Philip Berryman explains, liberation theology is, quote, "an interpretation of Christian faith out of the suffering, struggle, and hope of the poor, a critique of society and the ideologies sustaining it, a critique of the activity of the church and of Christians from the angle of the poor," end quote. Now, while Lincoln was not working out of a faith context in the same way that liberation theologians were and are doing, nevertheless, there is certainly some overlap between liberation theology and the Emancipation Proclamation that perhaps set that document apart as a proto-liberation text. What can we learn from Lincoln's freeing of the slaves in the southern states? In answering this question, I propose we turn our attention to the political context for our discussion today. We are living in the immediate aftermath of one of the most contentious presidential elections in our nation's history. In Lincoln, we find a politician who served in an even more contentious time. And yet, Pope Francis understands the gravity of our current moment. In his address, he stated, quote, "All political activity must serve and promote the good of the human person and be based on respect for his or her dignity," end quote. The context today is a national setting when many people in the United States are not interested in bringing forth the common good. Rather, many are convinced that the individual good is the greatest. This is not a new phenomenon. But with the advent of social media in our generation, as Pope Francis states in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, social aggression has found unparalleled room for expansion through computers and mobile devices. Moreover, recent waves of allegiance to certain populist figures in the national political landscape, I'll let you imagine who I'm thinking of here, further divides an already diverse nation. Francis continues, quote, "The way many platforms work often ends up favoring encounter between persons who think alike, shielding them from debate. These closed circuits facilitate the spread of fake news and false information, fomenting prejudice and hate," end quote. Or, to be more concrete, the insurrection of January 6th. But what can drive out this hate? To quote from our next great American, only love can do that. One of Martin Luther King's best known texts is his letter from a Birmingham city jail. At the very outset, King mentions that this letter is written as a direct response to the criticism that many leaders had placed on him and his recent protests in Birmingham as unwise and untimely. King argued that as a Christian, he was compelled to carry the gospel. His famous quote rings forth, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." King expresses a serious problem that those who wrote to him criticizing his protest were only concerned about the effect of the actual protest. King laments that these same voices seem to have no concern whatsoever for the causes of the protest. They never mentioned any sort of problem with the racial injustices or the maltreatment of Blacks in the city, but only with the actions of the protests themselves. Importantly, King notes 4 basic steps in any nonviolent campaign. 1, collection of basic facts to see if injustice is alive. 2, negotiation. 3, self-purification. And 4, direct action. King and his supporters carried out the action because they felt as though they were the victims of a broken promise. Namely, they had been assured that the segregation in Birmingham would end, but it never did. So they believed they had no choice but to act as they did. In response to his critics who argued that the protest action precluded any type of negotiation, King contends that the whole purpose of the action itself was actually to foster negotiation. He posits that nonviolent tension is necessary for growth. Quote, "History is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and give up their unjust posture. But as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups are more immoral than individuals," end quote. He laments, as you all know, justice too long delayed is justice denied. Furthermore, King informs readers that it is very easy to judge Blacks for their unrest if they have not experienced the inhumane treatment that Blacks had experienced. Or, as we might say in today's common parlance, King asks that those who would criticize the protest action first acknowledge the effects of their own positions of privilege on their overall perspective. King then moves to discuss the great concern that many had over the fact that he and his supporters broke laws, pointing out that there are actually 2 types of laws, just and unjust. He cites St. Augustine and claims that unjust laws are not laws at all, because they degrade the human personality. Segregation, King says, is just such a law, an unjust law, because it substitutes the I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship, and in so doing, relegates persons to things. One who breaks unjust laws must do so openly and lovingly, and be prepared to accept the consequences, such as jail time. This tactic of civil disobedience, however, is nothing new. King cites examples from both scripture and the early church to prove his point. Moreover, he expresses his grave disappointment in the white moderates who are more devoted to order than to justice. He notes that it is illogical for one to say that nonviolent direct action leads to violence, just like it is illogical to say that the robbed man asked to be robbed by having money. I urge you to think of the rhetoric here that surrounded looting and rioting this past summer in response to the murder of George Floyd. I think we can all see the parallels here. Through King's epistolary gesture from Birmingham, he makes clear that letter writing affords us the opportunity to stand up for what we believe to be the most important things in our lives. And the letter from a Birmingham city jail is the prototype of such a correspondence. King makes it clear that God's law takes precedence over any unjust law created by human beings. Today, our society faces many of the same ills as did the United States of 1963. For example, we're still threatened by nuclear war. The major appeal of King in this letter, though, for racial justice has also not yet been achieved. We are living in a country today, as you all know, where Black children are targeted by police. If this letter tells us anything, it must be that patience is not always a virtue. Sometimes it may in fact be a vice. We must stand up for what is just, regardless of the consequences that we might experience. To coin a phrase that is common in Jesuit pedagogical lingo, we must practice a faith that does justice. If ever there was a patron saint of that ideology, Martin Luther King would be the person. I want to encourage all of us to pray for his intercession that we might work for justice in our day. Moreover, we can take him as a model for how to act in the face of oppression. Now, like King, Dorothy Day, our third great American, saw an inherent link between all forms of social injustice. It would be impossible to have war, for example, without poverty and racism. To use the language of Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si', everything is connected. A major question in recent years has not been, is Dorothy Day a great American? However, the question has been, is Dorothy Day a saint? Even if the United States Catholic bishops reached a unanimous decision about a decade ago about Day's cause for canonization, there has been no small debate in the larger society, and especially the Catholic worker movement itself, over whether or not she should be canonized. This debate finds its origins in one of Day's most famous quotes: "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed so easily." Many of those who knew Day best, though, were convinced that this type of rhetoric came from a mixture of humility and a true understanding that any good that comes from her life is the result of divine grace. As one of her close collaborators, Robert Ellsberg, puts it, if Dorothy Day was not a saint, it is hard to know what meaning that word should have. But for whom and of what is Dorothy Day a saint? The church has been calling us over these past decades to a new evangelization. After the Bishops' Synod of October 2012, the Synodal Fathers composed a list of some 58 propositions for consideration after the work of the Synod. Simply scanning this list gives one the impression that Dorothy Day prefigured the new evangelization by decades, because she fulfills almost each proposition perfectly. Let me touch on just a few. First, Proposition 15 concerns the new evangelization and human rights. For Day, the most basic human right was a right to life, and equally important was the common human obligation binding on all people to ensure that their brothers and sisters enjoyed the same right. Day believed that this right was most often violated in warfare. Moreover, the obligation to uphold life for all has real consequences. As she wrote in 1936, quote, "Christ is being crucified today, every day. Shall we ask him with the unbelieving world to come down from the cross? Or shall we joyfully, as his brothers and sisters, complete the sufferings of Christ?" End quote. For Day, being obliged to ensure others can live sometimes means laying down our own lives. The second proposition of the new evangelization that is especially pertinent here is their 31st proposition, new evangelization and the option for the poor. As we know, it was part of Day's legacy that she spent so much of herself serving the poor that she and her movement became identified with living in voluntary poverty. As Day puts it, the commitment to the poor also has to be one on which the Christian stakes her life. Quote, whatever we can do to combat these widespread social evils of poverty by combating their causes, we must do. But above all, the responsibility is a personal one. The message we have been given comes from the cross, end quote. Lastly, I wish to focus on propositions 52 and 53 regarding ecumenical and interreligious dialogue, respectively. For Day, the most important thing that guarantees human rights is not one's religious tradition, but rather one's humanity. It is simply because of one's human nature that she has dignity. As Day wrote in the postscript to The Long Loneliness, quote, we were just sitting there talking when lines of people began to form, saying, we need bread. We could not say, go be thou filled. If there were 6 small loaves and a few fishes, we had to divide them. There was always bread, end quote. The bread served not only as an antidote to hunger, but also as a sign of love for people, regardless of their religious background. In speaking on Day to Congress, Pope Francis noted, at the same time, I would encourage you to keep in mind all those people around us who are trapped in a cycle of poverty. They too need to be given hope. The fight against poverty and hunger must be fought constantly and on many fronts, especially in its causes. I know that many Americans today, as in the past, are working to deal with this problem. And so I ask today, what are we doing to take up the mantle of Dorothy Day to bring hope to others? One of the 20th century Catholics most closely identified with Day was Thomas Merton. He was singled out by Pope Francis as, quote, above all, a man of prayer, a thinker who challenged the certitudes of his time and opened new horizons for souls and for the church. He was also a man of dialogue, a promoter of peace between peoples and religions, end quote. As we try to think about what unites these 4 people Francis considers great Americans, I am especially cognizant of the time in which we live, and even the particular week we are living. Earlier this week, as you all know, there was the verdict that confirmed what we all saw with our own eyes. Derek Chauvin is guilty of murdering George Floyd. As Brian Massengale put it in his NCR article yesterday, the feeling we have is vindication, not celebration. So I asked, when will we be able to celebrate? I would suggest that Merton has some important things to teach us about religious goals and when this moment of celebration will finally arrive. Writing more than 5 decades ago, Merton ends his essay, Religion and Race in the United States, with these chilling words, quote, we live in a society which, while appealing to Christian ethical ideals, violently negates its Christian pretensions and in so doing drives a radical minority to desperation and violence. The white Christian cannot in such a situation be content merely to march with his black brother at the risk of getting his head broken or of being shot. The problem is to eradicate this basic violence and injustice from white society. Can it be done? How? End quote. First of all, can it be done? I've been teaching a course this semester to honor students here at Marywood entitled Racism and the Church. The conclusion we've been coming to is that yes, it can be done. The scriptures tell us as much. Imagine the Israelite slaves asking themselves if liberation from Pharaoh could be done. Imagine Jairus, whose daughter was dead, or the woman suffering hemorrhages for 12 years, wondering, can it be done? When they begged Jesus for healing. Imagine Mary Magdalene and her companions on that first Easter, daring to wonder, can it be done? Being people of faith means admitting, and people of hope, means admitting that it can be done. It is possible. But the second question Merton asks is even more challenging. How? James Cone, writing at approximately the same time as Merton, answers much in the same vein of Jesus when Jesus says, be born again. Cone contends that all people must become Black. He writes, quote, to be Black in America has very little to do with skin color. To be Black means that your heart, your soul, your mind, and your body are where the dispossessed are, end quote. Where are the dispossessed in your life and in mine? This is where Merton's teachings on contemplation can help us find the way to concrete answers in our daily lives. This contemplation, Merton writes, is not the fruit of our own efforts. It is the gift of God who in his mercy completes the hidden and mysterious work of creation in us by enlightening our minds and hearts, by awakening in us the awareness that we are words spoken in his one word and that creating spirit. In the spirit of contemplation, our four great Americans then find common ground. But what about us? As Ormond Rush has concluded in his study of Vatican II, another particularly famous line from that council, this time from Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document on the sacred liturgy, that this passage is determinative for understanding the spirit of the council. Rush writes, quote, "The full and active participation by all the people is the aim to be considered before all else, for it is the primary and indispensable source from which the faithful are to derive the true Christian spirit," end quote. Rush continues with his own hermeneutical observation. Full and active participation of all the faithful means appropriate participation by the laity in the teaching, sanctifying, and governing of church life, and in the mission of the church in the world, since the whole people of God, from the bishops down to the last of the lay faithful, share in the prophetic, priestly, and kingly offices of Christ. But we don't just parachute into action without any preparation. This is what makes these four great Americans great examples for us. For Lincoln, it would be a political respect for the common good. For King, the penultimate step in any nonviolent campaign, self-purification. For Day, meaningful dialogue and prayer. And for Merton, contemplation. These moments where the four great Americans overlap are, ironically, not especially known for being famous American values. And yet they lead to something: direct action, liberation, works of mercy that define what Pope Francis calls the richness of American cultural heritage. We know what the challenges are in our country today, but what do these models of hope teach us? Let me just conclude with one simple reminder. Each of the four figures I mentioned here did much more than simply write or preach about hope. They enacted the words of Daniel Berrigan: to be hopeful, do hopeful things. They each acted with hope. For each and every person on this Zoom call today, acting with hope, doing hopeful things will look slightly different because each of our lives looks different. But once we spend some time in silence and reflect on the particularity of our own existence, the answer will become clearer to us. Then we have only to carry it out. And so we live in hope. Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Dan. For those that have questions, we are going to go ahead and hold off and have a conversation at the end of all three presentations. If you do have questions now and you want to get them to me before they escape your thoughts, go ahead and toss it in the chat directed towards me. I've got a document going where I'll toss all of them and we'll revisit them in conversation after. But once again, thank you so much for that powerful presentation, Dan. Next up for this panel, we've got Dr. Karen Ross, who is also a graduate of Loyola, so continuing the trend there. She's going to be presenting her panel presentation entitled Catholic Sexuality Education in Light of Me Too and Church Too, Learning from Survivors of Sexual Assault. Dr. Karen Ross is a visiting assistant professor of theology and the director of the MA in Christian Doctrine program at Marquette. She teaches courses specifically in feminist theology, sexual ethics, Catholic social teaching, and social ethics. Specifically here at Loyola, she graduated from our ISET program with a concentration in Catholic feminist theology and sexual ethics. Her current research uses ethnography in order to provide a feminist ethical analysis of the sexual education of Catholic young women and girls. Okay, so continuing our discussion of hope and our current context. Go ahead, Dr. Karen Ross.
Thank you to the Hank Center for having me, and particularly for the organization of Megan and Kathleen. And I'm also excited to be speaking alongside my friends, Brent and Dan. But I fear that I am a little bit more of the challenge rather than the hope. But perhaps that's why I'm sandwiched in the middle. And I just wanted to give a content warning that I'll be talking about instances of sexual violence and manipulation. On October 1st, 2020, sexual and spiritual abuse survivor organization Into Account published a comprehensive report on Catholic composer David Haas, highlighting the stories of 44 women who have experienced, quote, sexually predatory actions by Haas. According to the report, Haas's first reported act of sexual violence occurred in 1979, and the most recent in 2020. At the times of the reported incidents, the ages ranged from 13 to 17-year-old teenage children, 18 to 24-year-old college-aged young women, and 25 to 53-year-old adult women. Haas's reported behavior includes sexual harassment and stalking, forced oral sex, forced ongoing sexual contact with children, manipulative spiritual and/or professional mentorship bonding, sexualized communications, sexual ambushes of women standing alone, grabbing, pulling, pinning down, and multiple forms of sexual assault, including rape of a child. Haas has denied these allegations in press releases and has expressed solidarity with sex abuse survivors. The David Haas report is one among many within the Catholic Church. Survivors of spiritual and sexual abuse have been speaking out for decades through the assistance of survivor organizations like SNAP, Survivor Network of Those Abused by Priests, and Into Account, as well as through the assistance of media investigations. These stories of manipulation and abuse are part of a greater #Church2 movement, which began in 2017 when Emily Joy and Hannah Posh contributed to the Me Too movement by asking for survivors of sexual abuse by clergy and spiritual leaders to share their stories on Twitter using the #Church2. It is clear that the Catholic Church is in crisis. And this crisis has exposed corruption and spiritual rot right through the centers of institutional power. Many questions remain. How can lay Catholics address this crisis while protecting the most vulnerable within our communities? Can educators, parents, and church leaders truly protect God's children in the midst of this institutional sickness? Where does sexuality education fit into all of this? From 2012 to 2016, I worked with adolescent girls at 2 different Catholic high schools in Chicago, helping them form gender empowerment clubs where they could talk about their frustrations, concerns, and experiences surrounding sexuality and gender as Catholic young women. Listening to their stories of frustration and pain inspired my doctoral research at Loyola University Chicago, which focused on the narratives and messages Catholic young women receive from their sexuality education and how these messages about gender, sex, and sexuality affect them today. For this project, I also conducted a brief review of Catholic sexual education manuals distributed for use on the papal, national, and local levels, focusing on the ways in which the pedagogy addresses young women. In 2015, I conducted qualitative interviews with Catholic young women ages 18 to 25 who have been raised in a Catholic environment, either parish, school, or home, preferably all 3, and were current students at Loyola University Chicago. The interview questions focused on the content and quality of their sexual education, including the most prevalent narratives and messages they received about sex, sexuality, and gender. I found many common themes in these interviews, including the overemphasis on modesty for young women and girls, the faulty or non-existent Catholic sexuality education programs on the middle and high school levels, and the implication that women and girls should be sexual gatekeepers for men and boys. One theme stood out to me as simultaneously shocking yet unsurprising. 1/4 of the research participants reported experiencing sexual abuse and/or manipulation, and described how their sexuality education contributed to feelings of guilt or shame after the abuse. In the summer of 2020, last summer, I decided to continue this ethnographic research project by interviewing Catholic young women from Marquette University, where I am now, in order to see if there were significant changes to the data 5 years later, and by collaborating with young women from a different Jesuit institution in the Midwest. There were many reoccurring themes that were similar to the 2015 project, and some that were different, primarily due to cultural changes in technology access, especially social media, and social movements surrounding gender and sexuality that influence young women in 2020. Out of 13 interviews I conducted within a 3-month span, 4 out of the 13 women shared stories of sexual assault, abuse, and manipulation, and the negative impact that these events had on their faith and identity as Catholic women. From both of these research projects, I learned that when I set out to inquire about sexuality education in an institution in crisis, what I would find would be painful stories of abuse, manipulation, and silence. So in this presentation, I will share excerpts from these stories of Catholic sexuality education, given the collaborators' experiences of harassment and sexual violence. I will also highlight particular narratives I discovered within these stories that exemplify institutional victim blaming of young women who have experienced violence or harassment. Finally, I will propose some ways in which Catholic sexuality education can be reconstructed to address this institutional sickness and protect the most vulnerable in our church. Listening to the stories of survivors, Grace, Sarah, and Kayla. When I asked the collaborators how they understood the relationship between their Catholic faith and their sexuality at various points of their lives, many use the words complicated or disconnected to explain the separation they felt between the two. This separation that many of the young women felt between their Catholic faith and their sexuality became even wider when sexual violence occurred. Across the board, the collaborators from the 2015 and 2020 research projects expressed frustration with the absence of curricula about sexual violence, consent, and healthy and unhealthy relationships in their Catholic sexuality education. This gap in their education and moral formation severely impacted the role that their Catholic faith played in the processing of their abuse, and even contributed to feelings of guilt and shame. Sarah, a 19-year-old Marquette student, originally from Tucson, Arizona, pseudonym, described that her relationship with God changed after she had been sexually assaulted as a first-year student. She shared, quote, "I was very upset with God and I didn't want to talk to him. I was like, what did I do to deserve this? With my faith, I had decided that I didn't want to get involved with anything. I was just focusing on getting through the day, and with God, I was not feeling any of it." Fortunately, Sarah had a supportive friend who encouraged her to speak with someone in campus ministry as she was going through the Title IX investigation. Throughout the investigation, she still attended choir practices on campus, which she described as a blessing in disguise, since she now believes that God was at work in the fact that she still had to attend even though she didn't want to be there. Sarah acknowledged that this participation, paired with the support from campus ministries, slowly helped repair her faith. However, lingering questions remained about her own sexuality and the way that the assault affected her sexual purity from the perspective of church teaching. She explained, quote, "As my faith began to heal after the assault, I began to wonder, am I now spoiled goods per se in the Catholic faith? So I struggled with that a lot. I broke down about that to my best friend. I had no idea what it meant. He was like, "Did you want to do this?" And I said, "No." He said, "Therefore, I think God thinks you are all right. You didn't want to do this, so you're not spoiled goods." She told me that this affirmation from her friend was really important for her to hear, since she was just trying to be a good person. The fact that Sarah was concerned about her own moral standing within the church, rather than identifying that Catholic teaching holds sexual violence to be a grave sin, points to the ineffectiveness of Catholic pedagogy on helping survivors of sexual abuse understand that they have done nothing wrong and that their value or goodness could never be spoiled. Grace, a 21-year-old Loyola Chicago student, originally from a suburb of Chicago, had a similar reaction of guilt and shame after her sexual assault during college. Reflecting on the assault, Grace confided, "I felt like I had committed this grave sin and that I was going to go to hell and not get absolution because, once again, sex wasn't talked about in the household for a reason. And because I was growing up in that environment, I should have been able to say no. I definitely fell into that feeling of, oh my God, I hate myself. Why would I ever do that? I did this horrible thing. I'm a horrible person in the church right now." Grace's feelings of guilt after the abuse was strongly impacted by the fact that she understood herself as a, quote, sinful woman in the eyes of the church, and that she had betrayed God by having premarital sex, even though it was not consensual. She believed that having premarital sex was such a grave sin that it wouldn't warrant absolution, and that since she grew up Catholic, she somehow deserved the consequence of abuse since she, quote, should have been able to say no to sexual activity in the first place. The guilt and shame felt by Sarah and Grace and their perception of how the church responds to experiences of sexual assaults bypasses the grave injustice and sin of sexual abuse and exemplifies this internal victim blaming that occurs when survivors understand themselves as spoiled or having done this to herself by having premarital sex. Grace, like Sarah, had positive experiences through university campus ministry after her experience of abuse that allowed her to find comfort in her faith rather than alienation. However, not every survivor of sexual abuse or manipulation has access to ministers who are able to identify sexual violence as a matter of injustice and explain to Catholic youth that if an action is not free, then it is not subject to the same moral standards and judgments. Furthermore, Sarah's articulation of her body being, quote, spoiled goods points to the harms perpetuated by purity norms within Catholic sexual pedagogy, which teach young women that their body is a thing that can be saved or spoiled. Kayla, a 19-year-old Marquette student from a suburb of the Twin Cities, experienced emotional and spiritual manipulation by her youth pastor, which began in high school and continued when she went off to college. She explained, quote, "When I went to college, the youth minister got very controlling of my life, incredibly so. He would call me every day and want to talk for like 2 hours. He would get really upset when I wouldn't respond to his texts. I was like, you were talking to me on 2 different Instagram accounts, Snapchat, text, and calling. This is really overbearing." And it progressed to a place where I was being gaslit by him quite a bit, end quote. When she began dating in college, the youth minister demanded to know everything about her relationships and warned her that she was leading her romantic partners astray since she, quote, didn't have control of her lust and sexual impulses. He also commented on her Catholic identity and verified whether her courses were, quote, Catholic enough. When she asked for space from him, he threatened her by telling her that she wouldn't be able to be a church camp counselor anymore, a role that she cherished. Kayla told me, quote, "I really started to dread going to church. He tarnished something that was so beautiful to me. If I had a positive experience at church, he was going to wreck it. And if I didn't, I was going to sit there and think about how I'm going to hell, according to him. So yeah, it really hurt my faith. I wish I saw it sooner because looking back, it's the gaslighting. Unfortunately, these stories of spiritual and emotional manipulation by leaders in the church are all too common, as the grievously large volume of Church 2 stories and clergy sexual abuse accounts can attest. Kayla told me that her relationship with her faith is, quote, slowly healing due to her strong connection to the Eucharist, but that it's definitely a journey. The survivor stories of Sarah, Grace, and Kayla point to a failure on the part of church leaders, parents, and teachers to address sexual violence and harassment as an integral part of children's spiritual and moral formation. While comprehensive sexual violence education curricula may not have prevented these young women from experiencing abuse or harassment, it may have offered them a different way of processing these experiences as vulnerable members of the church. They might have known that they are not at fault for what happened, that they are believed, and that the church unequivocally stands against all forms of sexual violence and abuse and with survivors. This involves holistic Catholic sexuality education that includes a robust sexual violence education curricula. When I asked Kayla what she wished she had learned from her Catholic sexuality education, she said, "I really wish that I knew more about healthy relationships." Similarly, Sarah told me that she hadn't learned about sexual assault or rape from her Catholic school or parish, and that her parents didn't talk to her about sex in depth at all. These silences are not simply absences, but actively contribute to the psychological, spiritual, emotional, and moral harm for survivors of sexual violence or harassment. Some ways in which Catholic sexual education curricula could be reconstructed to eliminate these harms include mandating a survivor-centered sexual violence prevention curricula for both the elementary and high school levels, teaching children about the importance of bodily autonomy and the necessity to respect the bodily autonomy of others from an early age, developing lessons that highlight healthy and unhealthy relationships based on equal power or a power imbalance, respectively, and train sexual assault advocates to serve as confidential advisors in schools, parishes, and youth groups. Can a church that is in crisis, that is rotting from corruption and abuse, truly protect God's children? We can't afford the answer to be no, since youth are depending on us for their flourishing, body, mind, and spirit. The Me Too and Church 2 movements have shone a light on the hidden, dangerous spaces of our institutions and shown that silence is, in fact, choosing to ignore this disease that affects every member of the body of Christ. The church's silence and poor pedagogy about sexual violence and harassment in their sexual education curricula, leading to a particular kind of victim blaming of survivors, is not only damaging to the spiritual, moral, psychological, and sexual growth of youth, but also contributes to a greater culture that promotes and tolerates sexual violence. One woman who experienced harassment and inappropriate advances by David Haas expressed to the National Catholic Reporter in an interview that as a church, we, quote, owe our community better. We owe victims better. Catholic educational institutions, such as parishes, homes, and schools, owe youth better. Better support, better educational and moral tools, and better ways to understand themselves as sexual persons. Unfortunately, these institutions often fail to do so by leaving important topics out of sexual education curricula, sending negative messages about purity, or failing to address power dynamics within unhealthy relationships. We, as a church in crisis, need to find a way out of the darkness and into the light. This involves accountability for harms done, as well as an unwavering commitment to provide youth with the moral tools and spiritual support they need when facing violence or abuse. Holistic Catholic sexuality education cannot eliminate all potential harms, but it can provide youth with crucial information that promotes their healthy sexual flourishing and help build a new church that values intimate justice and stands with survivors. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Karen, and for shedding light on such an important issue. And we'll revisit it in the conversation that follows the presentations. Again, as with Dan's presentation, if anyone has any questions for Karen or any comments, please go ahead and direct those to me. I do have that separate document going for when we have our conversation afterwards. All right. So that brings us to our third and final presenter for today, and that is Dr. Brent Little. Brent is a lecturer in the Department of Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. He also holds a PhD from Loyola University, Chicago, and he is the co-editor of Revelation and Convergence, Flannery O'Connor and the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. His most recent articles have also appeared in Religion and Literature, Philosophy and Theology, and Horizons. His presentation for the panel today is entitled Liberating the Religious and Literary Imaginations, The Cross in Morrison's Paradise. All right, so we look for both challenges and hopes here with Brent. Go ahead.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you to the organizers at the Hank Center, and also it's just a joy to follow up behind Karen and Dan. So, in her essay, God's Language, Toni Morrison, the 1993 recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature, describes the challenge she set for herself with her 1997 novel, Paradise. Quote, "Is it possible to write religion-inflected prose narrative that does not rest its case entirely or mainly on biblical language? Is it possible to make the experience and journey of faith fresh, as new and as linguistically unencumbered as it was to early believers who themselves had no collection of books to rely on?" Unquote. I believe Morrison accomplishes this in her novel partly by reimagining the central symbol of Christianity, the cross. To be clear, I say partly to indicate that my topic is just one dimension of this complex and often ambiguous novel. That said, in Paradise, she encourages believers to reimagine the cross, not as a triumphalist Christianity that builds exclusivity and tribalism, but to see the cross as a sign of divine solidarity. In the course of the narrative, she maps the cross onto the bodies of socially marginalized and wounded women who are lynched in a clear act of scapegoating. Morrison depicts these lynchings as a kind of modern crucifixion, and thereby reimagines the cross as an embodied symbol that resists unjust oppression. In this case, the novel's title, Paradise, refers ironically to the all-Black town of Ruby, Oklahoma, a town organized and dominated by the male elders of 8 founding families. This irony hits the reader immediately as the novel famously begins, quote, "They shoot the white girl first," unquote, a line that establishes the racial dynamics at play. The opening pages, set in 1976, give a glimpse of the plot's climax nearly 300 pages later, 300 pages which details the history of the town and numerous characters over the previous decades. Near Ruby is a so-called former convent where a community of 5 women, racially mixed, reside, none of whom are from the area, but who have surprisingly found themselves in this unlikely community due to various events of trauma and woundedness. As Morrison notes, Paradise inverts the typical dynamic of racial purity in the American context. Instead of whiteness as the hallmark of what defines the other, Now the stranger, in her words, is every white or mixed race person. Morrison never indicates which of the 5 women is the white girl of the opening line. In other words, this is a community where differences are recognized, but do not become a means to other or exclude a person. But the women threaten Ruby's male authorities, for they live and act outside the confines of Ruby's form of Christianity. When tension within Ruby amongst the men, both young and old and between various families, reaches a boiling point, they scope the women and plot to murder them to reestablish control. And yes, for those of you who know the thought of Rene Girard, you can definitely read the novel through that lens. As just mentioned, the women live in what was once described as a convent, although in actuality, it was previously a Catholic religious school for Native American children run by the Sisters of the Sacred Cross, and I doubt that name is a coincidence. But by the time of the late 1960s and 1970s, the convent has become the unintended home to the women who live mostly apart from the larger world, other than their interactions with the inhabitants of Ruby. In time, the women transformed the space to reflect their own unique spirituality, blending the Christian tradition, for example, with indigenous Brazilian and African spiritualities. But these Catholic Christian symbols dance with the symbols of other spiritual traditions, not in antagonism, but in a richly creative dialogue. In so doing, Morrison performs a subtle critique of certain forms of exclusionary Catholicism, such as the original religious sisters and, of course, exclusionary forms of Christianity in general. The sisters are certainly providing a home and an education to the girls who would otherwise be abandoned, but they forbid their charges to learn about their own cultural traditions, be these a Native American heritage or the Brazilian heritage of the orphan Consolata. I highlight Consolata as she becomes the de facto leader of the community decades later, when it has ceased to be a religious school and has become this unlikely shelter for these 5 wounded and traumatized women. In a public appearance with Cornel West, Morrison once described Jesus's crucifixion as like a lynching. Interestingly, she makes this comment in reaction to the controversial film, The Passion of the Christ. But her comment resonates with James Cone's recent book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, or relatively recent. As the title suggests, Cone explores the analogy between Christ's death on the cross with the tragic and shameful history of lynching inflicted on thousands of Black men and women in America's history. Quote, as Jesus was an innocent victim of mob hysteria and Roman imperial violence, many African Americans were innocent victims of white mobs. Both the cross and the lynching tree were symbols of terror, unquote. Cone notes the blindness of much conventional white theology throughout the 20th century, for white theologies missed the powerful similarity between innocent Black lives tortured and murdered on a tree and the torture and murder of Christ by those in power and shielded by political privilege. The cross and the lynching tree are, in his words, the essential symbol of Christianity and the quintessential emblem of Black suffering. Yet there is an irony in God's message of salvation and love for the oppressed revealed through a symbol of weakness and terror. Whereas Cone argues, salvation is only possible in, as he puts it, solidarity with crucified people in our midst. Faith that emerged out of the scandal of the cross is not a faith of intellectuals or elites of any sort. Yet a strong imagination, he notes, is necessary to see that the cross continues to be a sign of redemption. Faith transforms the imaginations to see the unexpected. In Cone's situation or context, to see redemption and beauty amidst the tragic suffering, in Cone's situation, this faith is to see redemption and beauty amidst the tragic suffering, not because unjust suffering is inherently good and redemptive, but so as to affirm the dignity of those who suffer. Of course, unlike Cone, Morrison is not a theologian, but she creates a similar space for the reader to connect imaginatively that's Jesus' death to the dignity of the murdered women in the novel. But by eliminating whiteness as the local source of power and patriarchy, Morrison reframes the issue as tribalism versus hospitality. The cross functions in the narrative at this intersection. Actual appearances of the cross at the former convent are fleeting, although I will note one very prominent example later in the novel. In fact, the cross appears most prominently in one of Ruby's churches around the middle of the novel. Amidst increasing tension with Ruby, 2 young people marry, as much to ease animosity between their families as out of any desire on their part. In addition, tension in the town has also intensified between the older male leaders and their children. As a bridge between the two families, two pastors from two different churches give sermons. The first sermon is by the traditionalist Reverend Pulliam, who depicts God as demanding obedience, a pointed message to the rebellious younger generation. They must earn God's favor through obedience to the authority in their town. But he is followed by the progressive-minded Reverend Midsner, who moves across away from the back wall, of the church, a place at distance that mirrors Pulliam's belief in a distant God, and moves across immediately in front of the congregation. Then he holds the cross silently for several long, awkward minutes. Too angry to speak after hearing the depiction of God as distant, judgmental, and exclusive, a God who justifies the closed theocracy of Ruby, Midsner preaches a silent sermon, wondering to himself that the congregants would he be able to see that in Jesus's crucifixion, in his mind, quote, this execution made it possible to respect freely, not in fear, oneself and one another, all of which testified not to a peevish Lord who was his own love, but to one who enabled human love, unquote. In other words, the cross demonstrates that God does not gift us divine love for us to control others, but as a gift so that one may love others better, a love grounded in a God-given inherent dignity. In this sense, Midsner is reminded the congregants, as the narrative describes, that not only is God interested in you, he is you. Midsner attempts to turn his congregants' understanding of the cross away from one used to justify fear-filled domination and exclusion to a recognition that the cross symbolizes God's solidarity and love with us that should spur acts of hospitality. Midsner's sermon is misunderstood and ignored in the moment, and tensions within the town continue to boil, leading to the scapegoating of the women in the convent as witches who have cursed the town, this sort of infamous climax that I keep referring to. Morrison captures the theme of divine solidarity in more than just Midsner's rebuke to his fellow pastor, particularly doing so in the character of Consolata. As I mentioned, she's the de facto head of the community. In brief, Consolata suffers from a twofold guilt. First, in her young adulthood, and remember, she is an orphanage from Brazil, so she only knows the world of this convent that she has found herself in. She has an adulterous affair with one of the male leaders of Ruby. After the affair ends badly, sunlight mysteriously seared her right eye, announcing the beginning of her bat vision, as Morrison describes, and she began to see best in the dark. Her guilt deepens further when she tries to use her unique supernatural gift. And if you don't know a Morrison novel, characters sometimes have supernatural gifts and they're never really explained. It's sometimes described as a form of magical realism. But anyways, in her case, her unique supernatural gift is her ability to sustain and sometimes heal people near death. She uses this gift to keep her favorite sister, Sister Mary, alive in her elderly years, out of weakness of devotion turned to panic. After Sister Mary's death, Consolata, now 54, becomes wary of God and seems to shrink her life into a wait for death. And although the arrival of the other women provides her a semblance of community, none of them know the depths of Consolata's depression or guilt, or that they are a burden to her. Consolata's transformation in the start of her healing occurs when she is visited by a traveler, a stranger who resembles her appearance with the same color, ears, and eyes as herself. Immediately before his appearance, Consolata is outside shortly after sundown when her vision can withstand the light. Although she complains to the deceased Sister Mary and only receives a refusing silence, she wonders at the sky, quote, in plumage now, gold and blue-green, strutting like a requited love on the horizon. She was afraid of dying alone, ungrieved in unholy ground, but knew that was precisely what lay before her. How she longed for the good death. I'll miss you, she told him. I really will. The skylight wavered, unquote. Some scholars, such as John McClure, sometimes regard Consolata here as dismissing God, or at least a traditionally Western Christian image of God. However, I would argue that a more sacramental reading complicates such an interpretation. There is something O'Connor-esque in the description of the skyline here. In O'Connor's fiction, such moments are often an indication of divine grace. An analogous reading is possible here. Consolata still seems to regard herself as unforgiven, despite the fact that she wonders at the requited love manifested in the sky's beauty above her. Perhaps then this is the source of her wonder, for requited love indicates that no payment or action is required on her part. Perhaps she marvels at the free gift of the beauty. Meanwhile, she maintains enough of Sister Mary's traditional Catholicism to mourn that she will not be buried on holy ground. But who is the who that she will miss? Since she addresses him, it is clearly not Sister Mary, and indeed it could be Christ or God more generally. In either case, at the sound of her complaint, the skylight wavered, perhaps indicating that transcendence breaks into her vision. And indeed, it is at this moment that the stranger appears and informs her that, "You know me," as he says, although he also identifies himself as a traveler with the claim, "I'm from far country." This latter curious description may be the stranger's way of saying he is from far country, or he is transcendence himself, a transcendence with whom she is nonetheless well acquainted. Morrison is possibly playing with biblical allusions to Christ. The stranger's insistence that she alone should give him a drink and not one of the other women reminds this reader of Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well of the Gospel of John. Further, he indicates a close intimacy with her through the same eye and hair color. This intimacy is a healing one that not only restores her vision, but is also reaffirming of her own sacredness. Perhaps Morrison is casting Christ here not as king, like the nun's name for their school, but Christ as a lover in a way that he was, as the prose puts it, looking at her flirtatious. In either case, Consolata's vision is restored, a physical healing to symbolize her spiritual healing. Afterwards, Consolata laboriously makes the other women a meal that some critics have described as a reworking of the Last Supper, thereby rendering Consolata as a kind of analogy for Christ. Further, Consolata models an authority around which nurturing, healing community becomes possible. And unlike Ruby, she does not diminish the women's individuality, but she requires them to face their wounds and trauma. Consolata, as she's described now in the narrative, is like a new and revised Reverend Mother, and she guides the women's recovery from the wounds, binding their community together such that the visitor might notice that the convent women were no longer haunted. When the men arrive during the climax to expunge what they deem as a malicious supernatural threat to Ruby, and there's a lot of plot points here that I'm skipping over just for the sake of time, they are disturbed to find no crosses in the women's bedrooms. But the cross becomes a body in the climax of Paradise through the lynched bodies of the 5 women. When the 2 men search the former chapel, the elusive text notes that the men discover on the wall behind the altar the outline of a huge cross, clean as new paint, is the space where there used to be a Jesus. This is ambiguous to say the least. Does the phrase "clean as new paint" mean that the women took down the cross as an act of rejection? Perhaps. But the absence of Jesus' body, while the symbol of the cross remains clean and new, invites the reader to recognize that a new lynching is happening. The crucified body of Jesus is analogically moved to the women, whose murder is simply another kind of lynching. The men's actions are what the cross, interpreted through a lens of solidarity, unveils and critiques, structures of a power oppressed through scapegoating. No wonder one of the would-be murderers fingers his palm cross. His ironic gesture indicates what he fails to see. When Consolata, shortly before her death, confronts the men, one of whom was her former lover, the narrative cryptically describes how, quote, Consolata narrows her gaze against the sun, then lifts it as though distracted by something high above the heads of the men. "You're back," she says, and smiles, unquote. The "you're back" seems directed not at the murderers. After all, why would she smile? But what if she sees high above their heads? Most likely, Consolata sees her traveler friend, the one who healed her vision. And just as Jesus' crucifixion led to an empty tomb, so the women's murdered bodies, sorry, this is a real spoiler alert here, mysteriously disappear afterwards, never to be found. Not because the murderers or any of the townspeople dispose of them, but seemingly as an act of divine intervention. In fact, when Reverend Misner visits the grounds later, he senses this presence, as if there's like this brief inbreaking of transcendence. And indeed, in a reworking of the resurrection story, the 5 women reappear in the novel's final pages. Sorry, this is also a really big spoiler alert. While inexplicably and uncannily, thereby leaving the reader to puzzle over these women's reappearances. And in an interview, Morrison casually describes the women as both dead and alive. So she clearly didn't want to give too much away about what she thought about it. John Wyatt correctly insists that, quote, ambiguity seems fitting, a sign of respect for a metaphysical reality that is beyond human thought. In this post-narrative, Morrison implies the women continue their journey of healing, but most likely in a different form of existence. Despite their own lynching and crucifixion, they live on. How and in what state, who knows? And the resurrections point to a divine solidarity that rebukes any forms of violent, exclusive religiosity. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that, Brent. Just as a quick note on timing, it is now 10:22. We did start 6 or 7 minutes later than anticipated. So if you can stay with us, I'm going to go ahead and go with the original planned time period, despite the late start, for comments and reflections. And what I'd like to do is go ahead, if you have questions or comments, throw them in the chat for me. I'd like to start with a few minutes just to have our panelists respond to one another if they have any questions or comments. I have some as well to follow up, and then we'll get into audience questions for the panel. All right.
I don't have anything per se, Marty. So if you've got something, go right
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that we had 3 wonderful presentations that really fit the theme of the panel in very different ways. We had, a very distinct and visceral problem, right, or challenge through Karen's presentation. We had responses both within the literary and theological imagination on Brent's part, as well as some of the ways in which the institution and the hierarchy might be able to respond to these questions. So I think that these presentations interchange with one another really well. And with that being said, I do have a question for each of our panelists. And I apologize for kind of utilizing my own research interests to guide these questions, but I'll go in order of the presenters. Dan, for me, as someone that does research extensively on Dorothy Day, Peter Marin, and the Catholic worker movement, that shout out, so to speak, by Pope Francis when speaking to Congress was massive. But I was wondering if you could maybe reflect a little bit on the fact that 3 out of the 4 American hero figures that Pope Francis selected for his conversation were explicitly pacifists, right? And it was not lost on me that he was speaking about them and their actions of resistance and nonviolence within a chamber responsible for, approving calls to go to war. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about the conscious choice of those figures within that sphere, if you follow my thought, and what that might mean for us as American Catholics.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marty. Yeah, I as you say so eloquently, I have the same sort of thought, occurred to me as he was giving this address. And I mean, just as a quick tangential note, it is sort of tempered a little bit by the fact that his fourth person, Lincoln, is so closely associated with the Civil War, right? I mean, the bloodiest war in our nation's history. So, I mean, it's tempered a little bit by that. If he had gone 4 for 4 on pacifists, then I think, even more. But I mean, clearly Francis is pushing the line on pacifism and the just war theory. I mean, for those people on the call here who have read his most recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti, you can very clearly see this near the end of that document. He has 5 paragraphs where he talks about war and peace and the death penalty. And on the war section, I've talked about this in another forum that actually Brent was involved with. In the war section, he actually has a footnote in Fratelli Tutti where he says that we no longer uphold the just war doctrine of St. Augustine in our day. Now, I mean, on one hand, of course, we can admit that things have changed in the 1700 years since St. Augustine put forth his just war theory. But on the other hand, there's never been a pope who said before, we no longer uphold the just war theory of St. Augustine. It's always been, he has always been central to the church's just war theory. So Augustine's just war tenets of, right authority, just cause, those have never dropped from the just war theory in the church's teaching. So for Francis to say we no longer uphold his just war theory, it's a continuation of the way the church has been moving in the last 25, 30 years away from the just war theory, more towards what Father Brian Hare calls functional pacifism. It's becoming more and more functional, honestly, with every passing church document. So it doesn't surprise me that Francis would name figures like Day, Merton, and King. I mean, I say that I was shocked when he gave the address. When I heard it, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this. But as far as backing up the church's sort of progressing position on this point, I think it's really in line.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. Going down the list of panelists, Karen, I've got a question for you as well, or maybe more of a not fully formulated comment. But first of all, thank you for speaking on such a topic that is clearly not being addressed in certain segments of our faith life. And one thing that stuck out to me about your presentation is your discussion of this idea of silence being violence, and the notion that we are not doing right by our fellow brothers and sisters by not addressing these issues. But I also think that there is not just silence in terms of omission, but there is also active silence in the way that some of the church scandals are being actively covered up or actively pushed to the side and being settled monetarily or what have you. So it seems like there is not just silence, but kind of active avoidance. So my question for you would be, if this is going to continue to be the case, do you see a role where academics and lay leadership are the way forward in this topic? And how do you see that impacting the way that the church moves on in the 21st century here?
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point about active avoidance, and in order to continue to repress and deny and hide the truth. And so, yeah, it's not just silence, it's this active, calculated, hiding of or repressing of facts and stories. So yes, and I definitely see, perhaps not even academics, but definitely teachers, lay adults in the lives of youth, and especially children, parents, as being really instrumental in speaking truth that is developmentally appropriate, of course, but really being frank about the sicknesses in our church and really being intentional about including developmentally appropriate education that talks about things like bodily autonomy, which sexuality educators outside of religious environments have been saying this for a long time, about talking about consent and bodily autonomy as young as 4 or 5, even earlier, and talking about healthy and unhealthy power dynamics in relationships. So it doesn't need to be particularly about, assault, but building up to having these tools and skills to identify what, manipulation looks like, what violence looks like, the same way that we educate youth in other ways very intentionally in the Catholic Church. This is just an intentional avoidance. I would argue that a lot of lay leadership, perhaps, parents, it's not intentional in terms of people want to protect our children. And I'm using that phrase because of the Virtus training in Illinois. It's called Protecting God's Children. I know in Wisconsin, it's Safeguarding God's Children. There is a need to talk about it, and there's even a want to talk about it, but some people don't know how. So there's some powers that be that are intentionally avoiding, and then some are just at a loss for how to talk about these issues with youth. I hope that answered your question.
No, it certainly guides the conversation, and I think it's important to not just be challenged, but also to highlight the hope that comes with your research. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. And then for Brent, I think for me at least, I saw a really helpful bridging of some of the topics that were going on in the other 2 presentations, in that whether it's something as visceral as Karen's research or something kind of being presented in a more general way via the avenue of a quick address to Congress. I think that there is a significant way that we can approach challenges and crises through this idea of the theological imagination and the literary imagination covered in your presentation. So would you be able to speak a little bit more about how you see this idea of the literary imagination functioning within the wider church at a more approachable level, maybe? So I know that both the Toni Morrison aspect of your presentation, as well as James Cone, both of them talk extensively about the importance of this type of imagination. So maybe how you see that literary imagination functioning as a tool going forward.
Yeah, I think there'd be kind of two initial responses to that. The first would be the way that really any great artist, whether it's somebody like Toni Morrison who's in literature or any art in general, the way it can call us to reimagine symbols that are central, and the way it reminds us the way that we interpret symbols can have real ethical consequences. So, do you think of the cross? I mean, to speak of the January 6th insurrection, there was crosses in the crowd, right? And that's a particular kind of exclusive Christianity that would be completely counter to what Morrison would be trying to do with her work, particularly in this novel. So I think it is a reminder to Christians, to speak now for the present audience, particularly Catholics, to think about are the ways that we think about our symbols, understand our symbols, how do they function ethically in concrete lives. And then the other great thing about art is that it forces us to think about the intersection between the concrete and the universal. So you can, when you read the cross in her novel, you especially if you're somebody like me who has a theology background, there's all this sort of conceptual theology that I have going on in the back of my mind. But now she's asking me to, okay, how's it functioning now in these sort of concrete situations? And I think art it's the adage, right, that the universal is through the concrete. So it does remind, I think, particularly those of us in the academy, that when we have tendency to maybe speak very universally or abstractly or conceptually in our theology. And it causes us to think also how that plays out in the concrete situation. So that's sort of my initial two responses to your question.
Great. Thank you so much. We do have about 4 or 5 minutes left here for conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to some of the questions submitted from our guests today. So I'm going to start. This is a question for you, Karen. So I'll go ahead and just read it verbatim. And if you need me to repeat it, I can as well. So the question is, do you think that there is a piece of this that is bound up with problematic interpretations of the Bible, or at least particular interpretations of texts about women or so-called purity? It seems that there is something fundamentally wrong in Christianity's founding myth. What did you find in your research?
The quick answer to that is yes. I think purity culture is, something that pervades, these ideas of, virginity being something that you can, that can be taken away, or, that you lose or you keep, and kind of this acts-oriented morality where, once you lose it, you're spoiled. Instead of thinking about relational morality, how do we build healthy relationships instead of, either I'm a virgin or I'm not, I'm pure or I'm spoiled. These dichotomies that are very acts oriented instead of relationship oriented. I think a lot of patriarchal interpretations are really bound up in this. And so, the idea that women are sexual beings that are dangerous, that are full of lust, and pure women need to safeguard themselves for the morality of men. I mean, that's something that has been within Christian theology in the interpretation of, just the moral life for a really long time. So that definitely Augustine and Aquinas have cast this long, dark shadow over sexual morality, in particularly for women. And this continues today, even when we say sex is good, your body is sacred. The messages about being spoiled or being tarnished are still prevalent in our institutions. And I would argue it's because the institutions are still dominated in a patriarchal model and in a way that oppresses women's sexuality and pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for that response. The next question I have here is for Brent. The question is, what is your sense at the end of the novel of the different representations of the women from the convent and Connie post-resurrection, so to speak? The novel describes Connie's resurrection as different from the other women, I think. How do you see this in relation to her journey throughout the novel and in light of the cross imagery in the text?
So, well, that's a wonderful question. That really must have been from somebody who's read the novel. So I actually see it as almost, let's bracket the issue of Consolata or Connie for a moment. With the other four women, I feel like their healing is still in process. For those who haven't read the book, basically they reappear to people that have in their sort of previous life before the convent. But exactly their interaction with those people are different depending on the case. So it's not quite, you can't quite say that it's, reconciliation. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It's more like, I see it as more like a kind of purgatory in a very loose symbolic sense of that term, in the sense of that it's like they're working them, not a purgatory in the sense of purging from sins. I don't mean that, but more in the sense of this sort of like liminal space, alternate space where they're still, in their case, not working out sins, but working out their trauma, their woundedness. They're still in the process of healing. Their healing is not complete. Consolata is a different case. So she's literally, that's the very last page of the novel. More so, those, she's being held by her mother, from whom she was orphaned as a very little young child. And the way it's described, Morrison herself at a panel at Harvard Divinity School several years ago described it as a kind of piete. And so if you think about that, that's a really interesting thing, because on one hand it says that her mom is a little bit like Mary, and then she herself has the Jesus role, which is interesting. But more importantly, there is the image that she's at rest. All the other women are moving. They're always moving. She alone is at rest. So in other words, she seems to be healed the most. And the fact that she is, in her mother's arms, and her mother's described as having like this blue, there's this blue imagery that, you can clearly connect back to imagery of Mary. That I see it as like, that's a sign that her very original breach, her very original source of trauma, her separation from her mother has been healed. In this alternate state, they're not in heaven, because the description is that they're still very much on earth, but they're in this like alternate existence. And I think it's a way of keeping it from becoming, she doesn't want this to become like, a form of apologetics, right? Oh, see, they ended up in heaven, right? It's trying to resist that reading. But I think that's basically what she's trying to get at with that symbolism there.
All right, great. For the sake of time, we are past our allotted time here. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and say that the remaining questions, if you sent them to me, I will pass those along to the panelists as food for thought. I will also say that they are probably more than happy to respond to them if you reach out via their emails directly, which I'm sure are available somewhere. I again want to thank the work that Megan and Kathleen put into this, and Dr. Murphy and the Hank Center for hosting it. I just want to say that I'm really inspired by the work that our graduates of Loyola are doing. They've raised amazing challenges and provided amazing hope for us as well. So I'm super thankful to have participated in this panel. And with that, I will turn it back over to our hosts.
Thanks.